Our ancestors lived in a world of gods and monsters, a world where spirits controlled the weather, a world where everything was now. Today, we live in a very different world, a world governed by the sciences, where mathematical relationships can reveal and reflect the movements of the planets, the movement of tectonic plates, and the existence of structures our ancestors could have never dreamed of. One of the relics of this older way of life are the myths that we enjoy telling, retelling, and reskinning, such as inside of the works of the authors like Madeline Miller and Rick Riordan. But amongst the sea of retellings and reskinnings of these myths, we have the question of, can we make new myths?
Welcome to Quid Pros Quo, where creativity meets academia. Here, we're all about leveraging our love of academia to improve both your creative writing practice and ours. Whether you're honing your craft or just beginning your writing journey, we're here to share scholarly insights, inspiration, and advice that benefits us all. Let's get started.
This week, we are considering the essay Mythopoesis in the Modern World by M. Alan Kazlev, who is an independent philosopher and esotericist. This essay spans a wide range of subjects relevant to myths and their construction. We're going to do our best to synthesize what you need to know if you are interested in creating new myths. So, let's get started. Rin, what is mythopoesis?
So, mythopoesis has many different definitions, but the one we're kind of working with in the literal translation is myth-making. So, myths, again, kind of a big idea, but to Kazlev, myths occupy a middle ground between our everyday world, the profane, and some kind of transcendent reality. The transcendent reality is more about humanity's spiritual capacities and longing than about any one religious tradition. So it's like kind of how many different cultures will have myths that are like somewhat similar, or they'll have myths explaining the same phenomenon, because to some extent there is a universal human experience and we want to understand it.
Yes, and inside of this middle ground in between the sacred or the transcendent and the profane or the everyday, that's the region where humans construct meaning. This is an argument that Kazlev is making along with other academics like Henry Corbin and Karen Armstrong. To Kazlev, myths are a human incarnation of this middle ground. And this isn't to say that the myth is some kind of character that embodies the middle ground, but rather that it renders the middle ground into something that is recognizable in human experience. So, if that's what myths are, let's talk about what makes a myth different from other kinds of stories and why some things qualify as myths and some things don't qualify as myths. First and foremost, purpose makes a big difference. We talked about myths being methods for making meaning inside of our own lives. So if a story has as its purpose making meaning, then it is a myth. If the purpose is wish fulfillment, then it's fantasy, according to Kazlev. Kozlev's conception of wish fulfillment is very gendered inside of this essay, and it doesn't really borrow anything from queer theory. It's very male versus female. And he talks about James Bond being an example of a story of wish fulfillment for men, and then Twilight being an example of wish fulfillment for women. As on our podcast, we're not as tied down to saying this is for men versus this is for women, because we want to be like, well, if you're a guy, there are things that you may like that are traditionally feminine. And if you're a girl, there are some things that are traditionally masculine you might like. And if you don't identify with either, maybe you identify with one more than the other, maybe you like both. But that's just something that we wanted to let you know as we're working through and parsing this essay.
I was thinking I'm going to bring like a personal story into this about making myths in our fantasy. I had my writing group go through Dauntless, which, as we all know, is like my big project at the moment. And I had this cool bit of in-world mythology, and I'm like currently trying to decide if it's actually mythology, because it's, oh, here's like how the Night Mother became evil. So, but in the mythology, she was once called the Night Spinner, and she would like spin the threads that her sister would then weave onto the loom of night, and that was like how you got the night sky. So like that becomes a myth. But then like, so you can have myths operating inside of your fantasy, and you can have fantasies operating inside of your myths. I'm trying to think of like a classic myth that has like a wish fulfillment inside it. I feel like any Greek myth where Zeus is involved probably has some wish fulfillment going in there. So know that these can like kind of nest within each other, and it can be not so cut and dried about which is myth and which is fantasy.
Yeah. Yes, definitely. And a big part of that has to do with how fantasy fiction draws on a lot of mythology in terms of its tropes and its images and its creatures. Another way that fantasy draws upon myth is in the way that they use Jungian archetypes. So Carl Jung was a psychologist who lived in Vienna, who had this theory that we as a species have a collective unconscious, and that this collective unconscious manifests itself inside of repeating shapes that occur inside of our dreams. Kazlev is making the argument, very much in line with other folks like Joseph Campbell, that something that makes a myth is its reliance and its use of these archetypes.
Finally, Kazlev argues that it's very difficult for myths to be created in a capitalistic framework, since capitalism rewards wish fulfillment. And to us, that's hard to like reconcile with the fact that modern myths are some of the most lucrative properties of lives today, such as Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, and Marvel. But you could make an argument that the capitalist impulse is running some of these franchises into the ground. I see this especially with Marvel. Like,
yeah.
I think I've talked about before, I'm not a huge Marvel fan. It's fine if you are. Like, they're entertaining, but I don't see much value in it beyond the entertainment at this point. Like, the earlier movies were great. I remember really liking Captain America: The Winter Soldier when I first saw it when I was like 14.
Mm-hmm.
But like, it was probably somewhere after like Civil War that I was like, this is just not as good as it was. And that's an opinion. And I'm not a diehard Marvel fan, so that might be the entirely wrong movie to say without that. Oh, the Marvel fans are going to be up in arms.
But hey, it's better to have an opinion than to just go along with it.
Email us, quidprosquo@gmail.com. I would love to hear why I'm wrong.
And we want to hear, what do you think about the relationship in between capitalism and myth? Because this is something that I think is worth exploring. If it, the entire argument is that people pay for wish fulfillment. People want to imagine themselves as the object of affection from, super hot guys, which is why you have Twilight and, Court of Thorns and Roses, and all, like, basically the entire romantasy genre is about that kind of wish fulfillment. On the other hand, like spy thrillers, those sorts of, not just spy thrillers, but also
like action movies. Like, I think of like the Avatar: Way of Water.
Yes. Military sci-fi, there is definitely wish fulfillment elements there where, sometimes you just want to be a badass. And, that sells. But I'm not sure that providing meaning to people's lives is necessarily a bad way to get money either. So we would love to hear your thoughts about that. We want to talk to you about it. Let us know.
And if you want to talk about the ethics of use like that, let's talk about that for a second. Because is it ethical for people to like make money off like wish fulfillment? And capitalism would say absolutely, because capitalism prioritizes making money.
Mm-hmm.
But like, should you be able to sell meaning to people? Can you sell meaning to people? All good questions. You should email us about them or comment. You can like leave comments on Spotify, I think. I've never done it, but it popped up today when I was listening to Psychology of Your 20s, and I was like, oh, neat. I'm not going to do that.
It is an option, though.
It is an option, and you should not be like me. You should be better than me and give your favorite podcast some feedback.
We love feedback.
We do love feedback. Little heart hand emoji.
So that kind of wraps up our summary of the relevant bits from this essay. This is a 40-page essay, so we have been doing major legwork to condense it down into a 20-minute podcast episode.
Honestly, kudos to Zac. He did all of it for this episode.
But there's more to look at if you are interested.
And again, it will be linked in the show notes.
Yes. Let's turn to what these principles and what these things mean for authors who want to create new myths. First and foremost, when I was reading this, I was thinking about how in order to create a myth, an author needs to have some kind of conception of the transcendent. If you are a member of a religious or a spiritual tradition, that is a good place to start for feelings of transcendence. Both Rin and I are also scientists, and so we understand that transcendence can come from a lot of different places. It can come from contemplating the natural world. It can come from interactions with other people, considering history. Whatever it is that inspires those feelings of awe, reverence, wonder, that is something that you want to keep in mind when you are building a myth.
Yeah. Secondly, you can consider the images and themes that resonate throughout your culture. And obviously this means myths are going to be cultural dependent, right? Like something that's mythic to the dominant culture of the US may not be mythic to the dominant culture of Mexico or even one of the subcultures in the US. And you can also think about the interplay of religious and spiritual traditions and culture. Like in Utah, there's like a very large proportion of science fiction and fantasy authors.
Yep.
And there's a dominant theory that this is because there's so many members of the Latter-day Saint tradition, which is, and there's all sorts of fun stuff with like going with that. I'll let Zac unpack it a little more because I think he'll do it better than I will.
Well, I think just to this point with the, this idea that what is mythic to one culture is not necessarily mythic to another culture. When I was writing a short story for the Association of Mormon Letters, since I'm a member of the Latter-day Saint tradition, there were images, there were archetypes that I was intentionally using inside of my fiction that were relevant to other Latter-day Saints, that if you were to read as someone outside of that community would not make sense, that, you just wouldn't understand. If you have read The Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe, that book, I am told, it relies on a lot of Catholic imagery and a lot of Catholic themes. So if you are a practicing Catholic, those sorts of things are going to be clearer to you than if you are coming from outside of the tradition. And so this plays into the some of the things that Kazlev was talking about with the intersection in between money and myth making. Because when you're thinking about myths, if the myths are culturally dependent, then the myth or the culture that your myth is situated within is basically going to be your audience for that story. So if your context is going to be the dominant culture of the United States, okay, whatever. You got 300 million potential readers to do it with, even though not all 300 million people inside the United States are a member of the dominant culture. If you are looking at a subset, then you're marketing towards them. It's also worth keeping in mind that if Kazlev is correct about that relationship in between the capitalistic drive, like really being inimical to the spirit of myth, then that may lead you to a different spot than what the current publishing trends are. Like we talked about romantasy as like a huge trend inside of publishing right now. If you're not going for wish fulfillment, if you're going for meaning making, you're probably going to be going in a different direction than romantasy.
Yeah, and you have to decide if you're okay with that, because like some people are writing to the market, and that is okay, and that is like well and good for them, and I'm so glad that they're making huge royalty checks.
Yeah.
Some of us are not writing towards the market, and that is a little bit sad. It's sadder because we're not getting big royalty checks and we live in a capitalist world. But we're also like making stories that like make meaning, and we're hoping that other people resonate with those stories. So you just have to decide which kind of camp you want to sit in, or if you want to like, if you want to and if you can straddle the fence.
Mm-hmm.
And then as you're trying to create new myths, as you're writing your story, seek to incorporate those feelings of transcendence and recurring images from your religious or spiritual traditions or the cultural traditions. Incorporate those into your setting, your plot, and your characters, and then pay attention to how those elements are influencing your readers. And you can do that through like targeted feedback, like beta readers or alpha readers even. And like when you see how it is influencing your target audience, you can either strengthen it or dial it back depending on what you're going for.
Yeah. In this episode, we have been unpacking the essay Mythopoesis in the Modern World by M. Allen Kazlev. We talked about what myths are, some of the considerations for what makes a myth rather than a type of fantasy story, and then some of the things to keep in mind when you are creating your own myths. Rin, do you have any last thoughts that you want to share with our listeners about Kozlev's thoughts, essay, any topics that we talked about today?
I think I'm good.
Alrighty. Thank you so much for joining us this week for Quid Pros Quo. We'll see you next time. Quid Pros Quo is hosted by DC Winters and CK Jensen. If you like this episode, please subscribe and leave us a rating on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like to contact us, you can email us at quidprosquo@gmail.com. Thank you for joining us today.